What do retail suppliers need to know about mergers and acquisitions? Quite a few major things, and a few of those are hidden. We'll show you on today's episode of the Savvy Supplier. Welcome into the Savvy Supplier, where our goal is to save you time and money. I'm Al Frank, alongside your chief pain reliever, Boyd Evert. Boyd is CEO and co-founder of HRG, and he's a true trailblazer in this industry. So Boyd, before we get to the hidden issues, what are some of the common issues suppliers face during mergers and acquisitions?
Well, let's break it down. So first, today, just for the sake of time, let's focus on the mergers and acquisitions on the retailer side. And when you're focusing just on the retailer side, one of the major issues is the lack of insight into the businesses that you're being merged, because retailers all require confidentiality agreements because they don't want you communicating their pricing strategy to their competitors. So as a supplier selling to a retailer that's merging with another retailer or acquiring another retailer, the first concern I always have is the businesses don't have a clear line of sight into the other business that's being merged together.
Well, that's interesting. What is it that the suppliers can't see? What's hidden from them in this equation?
Well, they can't see the terms and conditions and pricing strategies, return strategies, all of which leads to the point that's in every single retailer agreement, and that is the most favored nation clause, which says whatever terms that you're offering in the marketplace, if you're offering several different terms, we get the best terms, whether it's a warehouse allowance, new store allowance, promotion allowance, whatever, that they will always get the lowest. And if you can't see what's going on in the other retailer that you're being merged with, suddenly now you're going to have this concern of, if our terms don't line up, then suddenly we're going to be held accountable because they'll use the agreement from one supplier and apply it to the other. And I've seen it cases after a merger where it goes both directions, that almost like line for line, well, and this is the correct amount that we should have been receiving. This is the correct allowance we should be receiving on this agreement, but then they flip over to the other side. And so you'll have sets of claims going back and forth. And I remember sitting in a room talking to these auditors that are going through these vendor agreements, and I said, can we pick an agreement and stick to it? I mean, you guys are going through and cherry picking, whichever one is the lowest of the two. And I remember one of the auditors saying to me, well, it's always the lower of the two. And I said, well, this individual's name is Scott. I said, well, Scott, what if it's the higher of the two? And he laughed and said, yeah, right, Boyd. So anyway, so it's the most favored nation clause is the biggest concern. After that, all the mischief happens at that point.
Who knew suppliers were nations? I didn't know.
Yeah, they're nation states. I didn't know that.
Well, let's talk about a problem that just keeps getting worse and worse these days, product returns. How does a merger or acquisition add even more product return headaches for the supplier?
Well, I should say out of the gate, returns are a headache without a merger or acquisition. So it becomes, I think, a cluster migraine when you bring the two together, right? Because just the top of mind would be you have actuals where you're just charging back for every return that comes back from the customer. And then there's also the allowance approach where you give them 0.5% or 1%, depending upon what it is, or maybe 2% allowance for defectives. And then the retailer will true it up to say, did we get enough allowance to cover the actuals? So if you've got one company that's doing actuals and another retailer that is doing allowances, you could easily end up overfunding it. In one particular case, we had one of our clients dealt with, one was actuals and one was allowance, and they continued to transmit the allowance, and the retailers, thank you for the allowance, and then continued to charge every single one of those items that was returned, and we ended up having to bill back to the retailer almost $500,000 just over a few month period of time. So it can add up very quickly.
I'll say, talking about excessive defective claims, it's possible the supplier could get an excessive defective claim even though there's nothing wrong with the product, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can have product that at the store, perhaps there is some abuse with the product. I'm thinking maybe like the filters you'd put in for heaters and air conditioners, right? Your HVAC. And then on the other side, you could have some products that are considered high theft, right? Where that maybe there's some theft going on. And the store folk, the people that are in charge of the inventory, those are the hourly people. Those are the ones that get trained. Usually it's a fairly high turnover. And you're trying to train them in how to make these inventory adjustments. And sometimes it's just human nature. You gravitate towards one habit of mind on how to process something. And so you might have somebody, the first thing they learn when adjusting inventory is when you have a defective, but then you show them, here's how you make an adjustment. If the amount on the shelf doesn't match what's in the system, you make this a correction. If they spent all yesterday working on just defectives and now they're doing inventory adjustments, you could easily see them sliding into that role. And so then they're taking inventory adjustments and processing them as shrink. So that's always a headache for the suppliers. And sometimes we'll find patterns in that. And a lot of times it is just a training issue. Sometimes there's bad actors in stores where we've looked at certain locations at certain times of the year where they only have a problem with defectives. They don't have one problem with theft, shrink. It's a miracle.
Let's transition to invoicing. Do mergers and acquisitions have an impact on invoicing?
Absolutely. And the invoicing is the one that sometimes is the most troubling, because all of this is done electronically. Usually the standard almost everyone uses is EDI, and you have your ERP system communicating with the retailer system over this EDI, and they map the allowances. And so let's say, just for the sake of discussion, that all the allowances map out. It's the same amount, and it's given at the invoice level, not at the line level, item level of the allowance on the invoice. The transmission codes are using a different code for, let's say, the warehouse, because EDI has several different codes you use to designate that this is an allowance for the warehouse, because we're shipping it to the DC, so we're going to give you this allowance. And then to turn around and this other retailer that's acquiring the former retailer, now you have a situation where they're transmitting one code for the warehouse allowance and they're requesting a different code. So what typically happens there in the invoicing is they'll take the code that they didn't ask for on the purchase order. They said, thank you for that 1% allowance. And then, oh, we didn't get the warehouse allowance. And so then they collect for the other warehouse allowance. So just getting those things mapped correctly in EDI is sometimes a little bit more complicated than meets the eye, because on paper, it looks like it's really straightforward. But once you get into the weeds, EDI can be very tricky.
Well, at the beginning of this, I mentioned some hidden problems. Are there some deeper hidden allowances that you haven't mentioned yet?
Yes, there are different allowance codes. You can have a new store allowance, new warehouse allowance, quantity allowance, a truckload allowance. But where it gets even more complicated is when you're offering a cash discount. And so when you're offering, let's say, for one retailer, you're offering 1% cash discount, and the other one you're offering 2%. And let's just say that that's just the way it was set up at the time. And at the end of the day, net, both retailers are getting roughly the same percentages. One retailer wants it more in allowances, the other one wants it more in the cash discount side. But it's a wash. But it's not a wash when you start comparing things, right? So now you'll have somebody where perhaps that they wanted an extra 1% in the warehouse allowance. Let's say that, we want you to invest in the warehouse allowance, so give us 2% for the warehouse allowance and only 1% on cash discount. And the other one goes the other way. The auditor, right, again, using the most favored nation status, will say, we should have 2% cash discount and a 2% warehouse allowance. So you can see how any of those where one is overfunded, then, deliberately, right, intentionally, at the request of the retailer, can lead you down a path where suddenly you're being asked to provide much more funding than you ever budgeted for.
How about discounts? Do mergers and acquisitions, do they affect discounts in any way?
Yeah, they sure do. So you can think of it from the perspective of when you're calculating total sales in, and perhaps you might have a rebate that if you sell so much product in during this period of time that you're entitled to an additional allowance or additional discount, that is calculated on, let's say, the net cost of the product. So to use an example, when you're online checking out on a website, let's say you're a member of that website, this retailer website or this third-party website, where it's free shipping and handling for certain items. And then some items that are special order, you got to pay for the shipping and handling. Sometimes you'll get into the basket as you're checking out, and you'll notice that you have some handling fees there. And so that would be essentially the shipping and handling that's attached to that item. But the other item, it's already, from the website's point of view, it's built into the cost of goods, right? Because they're not going to ship it out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They're going to compensate for it. So it's really built into the cost of goods. It's the same thing that happens in retailing. Some retailers want everything netted out of price, so that essentially they're going to say, we'll come and pick up that merchandise. We don't want you to ship it to us. We've got a great fleet. We'll come and pick up that merchandise. So don't charge us for freight. We'll pay the freight. And then others, let's just say it's a high shrink category like consumer electronics and entertainment. So they're going to say, well, we really want to pay the freight because we want to control that merchandise up until the time it hits your dock. So that means the price of the freight is not built into the cost of goods. And so now you have a freight factor. That's what it's referred to. A freight factor is the difference between the two. And so the cost of each item suddenly appears to be out of alignment. So again, I've been in a situation where there's been a merger and one retailer leaned into, we want the cheapest price. We'll come and pick up the items. So give us the cost, right, to collect that merchandise. The other one insisted on prepayment. And then after the merger, then it might appear, if you're not showing whether it's freight, whether the freight is prepaid or collect, suddenly it now looks like one retailer is being taken advantage of. And so you can have a pricing claim saying this item costs more than this item, and the most favored nation clause says that we're entitled to the lowest cost. You didn't give us the lowest cost. We're like, hey, time out. That has to do with freight. That has nothing to do with the cost of goods. But again, that's one of those conversations that when a buyer's looking at the cost of goods, freight is not top of mind usually, right? And that's not going to be the first question. And if you as a supplier are in a situation where you know your company does ship some items and you do know that in some cases retailers pick them up, then you may just need to start communicating with your buyer. After the merger, we may find that the freight terms aren't quite aligned. So before you get upset about when you see the different prices, please consider the fact that some of this might be the difference between prepaid and collect freight.
Well, let's talk about promotions for a moment, because I have a feeling that might impact suppliers during a merger or acquisition.
Yeah, there's two major strategies with pricing in retailing. One is an everyday low cost, so you can deliver an everyday low price to the consumer. Another one is it's more of a high-low strategy, typically grocery, drug channels, where the retail's a little higher than it normally is in your discounters, but when it goes on promotion, it's usually lower than the everyday low price at the discount retailers and driving traffic. So you might have a BOGO or a BOGO 50, and those two strategies don't blend well, right? Because what can happen is again, let's say these two different strategies come together. One that comes to mind, when Amazon acquired Whole Foods. Whole Foods tends to be more of an upscale. They tend to offer higher quality items than you would at a regular grocery store. And Amazon's known for, right, it's everyday low cost, everyday low price, right? They're really trying to drive the cost out of the system. And so one of the concerns I remember, reading in the various industry publications about how is this pricing strategy going to be executed, right? And how is that going to shake out? So let's just imagine a similar situation where you've got two different pricing strategies coming together. Well, what could easily happen is an auditor can look at the prices and, again, using the most favored nation clause, say our everyday price is higher than over here in the high-low channel. So really, we're going to bring it down to the EDLC, EDLP. Oh, and then your promotions are even better. So so then they end up getting the best of both worlds, right? And so if you suspect that you're entering into, or one of your customers is entering into a merger, right? One retailer's acquiring another or merging, and they have different pricing strategies, they go to market differently, then you want to get ahead of that conversation saying, we're going to need to align on where this is going to land. Are we going to stay EDLC, EDLP, or are we looking more of a high-low strategy? And you start getting that clarification up front. And so then, because whenever you don't do that, it sounds like you're making excuses. Like, well, there's a story. Let me tell you, the buyer's not going to be interested in a story. They're going to be interested in getting their money, right?
Well, Boyd, thanks for uncovering some of those hidden landmines for suppliers today. I'm sure they are very grateful to you for that. And one good way, I think, to show your appreciation is to like and subscribe to the podcast, and that will help more people to find us. So we thank you for liking and subscribing. And if you're wanting more information from us, we've got 2 websites for you to visit, SavvySupplierPodcast.com and HRG-audit.com. These websites are also in the show notes, along with an email address for Boyd. So feel free to reach out to him directly to get some help when it comes to managing your deductions. And HRG is the place to go to get expert auditors on your side. And if you have a question or a topic for an upcoming podcast, we'd love for you to let us know that as well. Our wish for you is this: wiser decisions, fewer deductions. See you next time on The Savvy Supplier.